What would it sound like if your entire world had just changed and everything you knew had disappeared? This is Elgar's Cello Concerto, and it's an incredibly famous piece, but most people don't know that it was written by a man who at the time was trying to make sense of the world. The piece was actually written in 1919, just after the First World War, and once you know what happened to Elgar, it's impossible to hear the piece of music in the same way. So, let's get into it. So in order to fully understand this piece, we really have to know what happened to Elgar and what he was doing beforehand. Elgar was a British composer and he was known for being very regal, very British. He was also a very introspective personality and he came from a pretty normal background. He lived in the British countryside and taught piano, for example. So this is Nimrod from Elgar's Enigma Variations, and he actually wrote this in 1899, so long before the Cello Concerto was written. He actually wrote the melody for this after a day of teaching, and he sat at the piano and improvised the melody. And that melody was then used for each of the Enigma variations. And each of the variations is actually about someone that he cares about, so his wife or his friends. And the Nimrod variation in particular is dedicated to one of his friends. So it has the introspective sound and nostalgic sound that Elgar is famous for. The music, while it still has kind of like a melancholy sound to it, because Elgar was a very introspective person, it does have some hope in it. It's in a major key, and you get this kind of rising melody. So you're getting, which has some hope in it, and throughout this piece, it kind of gets bigger and bigger, and it feels very put together. For example, at the peak of this piece, the biggest part, about 2/3 of the way through, it sounds like this. It sounds very grand and open and confident, and that's because it's major and it's really thick chords. And to me, this is a strong reflection of how Elgar wrote before the war. Everything was very regal, very British, and he had a lot of stoicism in his writing. However, during the First World War, Elgar kind of stopped writing. Not completely, but he didn't produce the same amount of works or the same amount of notable works. And this is largely because Elgar was very affected by the war. During the war, a lot of people that Elgar will have gone to fight in the war, and this completely changing of reality for Elgar had a massive impact on the way that he wrote music. The way that he wrote music became no longer pieces like the Nimrod, which is a nice piece dedicated to people that he loved. But instead, you get pieces like Elgar's Cello Concerto, which was written in 1919 just after the war had finished. In this piece of music, you can tell that Elgar is longing for a world that is no longer there. I mean, it's such an incredible piece, but there's so much going on to me that makes it sound this way. So first of all, it's written for the cello, and to me, the cello is the closest instrument you can get to the human voice. So you get this kind of crying out, wailing sound from the vibrato on the cello. But also, the piece is in the key of E minor, and E minor is a very open, dark sound. So this, to me, sounds much more angry and upset with the world. You have this massive E minor chord on the cello, which firstly, it's kind of unusual to have a chord on the cello and you have to separate out the notes, which is why instead of this, you get this. But also, it has this incredibly passionate melody over the top. Which, unlike the Nimrod, where it was ascending and in major, and sounds positive and hopeful, in this case, it's descending and minor, which sounds negative and depressing. I mean, I absolutely love this piece because there's so much stillness in it like this against the really big sound that you have at the beginning. When I was in the depths of learning the piano, there are lots of tools that I wish I'd had. And that is exactly why I built an app called The Practice Room. The Practice Room is an all-in-one place where you can log your practice sessions, get statistics and insights about your playing. There are resources like theory articles, an entire pieces library with backgrounds for all the pieces, what you should be able to do before you play them, what you'll get from learning them. There are practice tools that will help you fix your playing, that will help you recognize chords and pieces of music, even a metronome. And I also do deep dive live practice clinics every 2 weeks on a very specific topic about learning the piano. So if that sounds of interest to you, then check it out with the link in the description. Okay, back to the video. So for me, this is almost like someone opening the door for the first time and going outside to see if everything's okay. You get this really tentative, scared sound from the cello that's kind of creeping upwards. And then after that, you have the orchestra that comes in with this solo line, which to me has a really ghostly sound to it. Jacqueline Dupree, who's the cellist that played this, is pretty incredible. So the cello now echoing that ghostly theme that was in the orchestra, to me is almost like, you know, someone following the person that's just gone out the door to see if everything's okay. The theme itself just has a really haunting sound to it, especially when you have these suspenseful chords underneath. The orchestra are actually playing something called a pedal note, which is where you have one note in the bass that stays the same while chords change over it. Which creates some tension in the music, and it makes it sound like we're all suspended in midair. So the combination of this held note and the moving chords in the middle, and then this ghostly melody that we've just heard from the orchestra, it really has this uncertainty about it. It feels like we don't really know whether everything's okay. But as with any type of grieving, even if it's grieving for what life used to be like, along with being unsure and sad, you also get angry. It's such an amazing piece of music because for me, it so accurately represents how Elgar felt at the time. At this moment in the music, it really builds, and it builds because it's almost like the realization is set in. And it has such a strange combination of kind of anger, sadness, but also passion. You get this theme returning in the cello, but along with moving chords underneath. And that section to me is actually quite reminiscent of the Nimrod because it does have those larger chords and it does have those moving chords in there, which to me makes Elgar sound like Elgar. But then you get this massive scale in the cello that kind of passes to the orchestra and just sounds kind of like he's in despair. I mean, it's incredible writing, and it's also really one theme. It's still Lee from the very beginning, but he's made it much, much bigger on the piano. And the interesting thing about this chord sequence is that you do get some reprieve in it. You get E minor, A minor, and then D major, which feels like a moment of rest. And then the melody kind of jumps up again to E minor. It kind of temporarily goes to C major. Then you get this half diminished chord, which sounds kind of tense, before landing back in E minor, which sounds kind of sad again. So the chord sequence, taking us to some major chords in there, and also changing us to different keys for a moment in the middle there, it really feels like the music is travelling and really expansive. Not to mention the fact that in some places there are 3 of each note, like 3 F sharps, to really thicken the texture of that melodic line. Now, a little bit later in the first movement of this piece, we do get a major section, which means that this is not all dark sounding. So this is really interesting to me because this does kind of harp back to how times were. This feels to me very reflective of that quintessentially British sound that you would get, maybe in like a really old movie. And as with any good story, the light makes the darker feel darker, and the dark makes the light feel lighter. Remembering how life was and how things were before the war makes the feeling of what it was in 1919 for Elgar that much more painful. Yeah, so at the end of that major section, you get this kind of really longing singing out for what was, which sounds like this. And to me, that singing melody over the top, once again descending, feels like it's kind of sinking back into reality in a way. It's almost like a dream. You're reaching out for something and then it's fading away as that melody sinks down. And also just the choice of chords and the voicing of those chords. They are very reminiscent of kind of early jazz, maybe big band sound. And then you get this minor transition section, which we've heard before, which is this section. And then at the end of that section, it transforms into this realization, this kind of turn back into that ghostly sound, like you're snapping out of the dream that you were in. And the interesting thing is now, this is one of Elgar's most famous pieces, along with the Enigma variations. But the reason I think this piece is so important is because it represents something very human. Elgar was in a situation where he'd built up a reputation as a composer that was very British, that represented society at the time. And then in the First World War, that world was taken away from him. He could no longer write music like the nobleman, the quintessentially British composer that he was. And so instead, we get writing like this, which represents something that I'm sure everyone can relate to, which is feeling like your life has changed and you can't go back to how it was before. But let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to find out why Rachmaninoff hated his most famous piece, then head on through and I will see you there.